reading from the Gospel. Today's Gospel lesson is from Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your home today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Would you pray with me? God, would you give us open hearts to receive, open ears to hear, open hands to respond? Might you speak through me, Lord, that your words would be heard. Fill in the gaps, Lord, wherever it's needed. Amen. Shame knows your name, but calls you by your sin. God knows your sin, but calls you by your name. This, I would argue, is the gospel according to Zacchaeus. Now, honestly, I could stop there and feel like that could be a full sermon, but we'll dig a little deeper. Because I wonder, what does it look like to call someone by their name instead of their sin, while still holding in tension the responsibility for the things that we do? Because I think this is how we hold righteousness and mercy together. We've been journeying through Lent and finding ourselves in the in-between, in this liminal space in the messy middle where God might meet us between 2 extremes. And I think as we're finding that often these 2 things we pit as extremes perhaps are instead companions. I think the same might be true for righteousness and mercy in our story this morning. Now, most of us, and I include myself in this, prefer our saints to be heroic, right? We edit their stories to the nub of their heroism. And this is one of the reasons why I love the Bible, because it doesn't shy away from telling the truth about its saints. If you read many of the hero stories from the ancient world, they are written to ed out the less than desirable qualities of their heroes. But not the Bible. Sometimes I wish I could have been alive during Jesus' time to see and experience Jesus walking on this earth, but when I read stories like Zacchaeus's, I'm glad I wasn't, because at least my junk didn't get memorialized in the most read book in the world. 2 weeks ago, we read the parable of the barren fig tree in Luke 13. And if you were here for that, you'd remember that the owner of the tree wanted to cut it down because it wasn't bearing fruit. But the gardener, in his mercy and tenderness, asks the landowner to give it more time, to wait and see if it might yet bear some fruit. Luke, who is incredibly intentional in how he structures his gospel, tells us the story of Zacchaeus in a tree. But not just any tree, a fig tree. I wonder if the fruit we expect from barren places, if we expect it at all, looks different than we might imagine. I wonder if Luke might be presenting some fruit from a barren fig tree for us to see. Now, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, a chief tax collector no less. And a tax collector was a greedy combination of embezzler and extortionist and a traitor to his people and a sinner of the worst sort. There was no one more hated than a tax collector. This man was loathed by his neighbors. He was considered to be the worst of the worst. Tax farming was this ingenious tool used by the Roman Empire to collect income and turn conquered populations against each other. You see, a tax collector lived among his neighbors. He had his finger on the pulse of business in the neighborhood. He knew what you did for a living and who your relatives were and just how much you could be squeezed for. And as a chief tax collector, Zacchaeus supervised his own subcontractors for his area. Often tax collectors would collect more than what was owed and stuff their pockets with the excess. And so, when we're introduced to Zacchaeus, the crowd grumbles at Jesus' invitation to Zacchaeus' house, and their righteous indignation isn't without cause. We understand their anger. This man had deeply harmed their community, had become a tool of the empire for extorting and hurting his neighbors. And then as he does, Jesus flips the script. We reach the spot where Zacchaeus was. He says, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." And I can understand the crowd's surprise and disgust. The text says all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." And I get it. I can imagine if I was there, and remember, I don't want to be because I don't want all my stuff written down. But if I was, I think, and this might have gotten written down, which is why I'm glad, I think I would have been one to pull Jesus aside and be like, "Listen, Jesus, I'm not sure if you're aware, but you're inviting the wrong people over to dinner. This guy is everything that we are against. This guy is everything that our faith is against. How could you invite him over for dinner and let him off the hook?" But as Nadia Bolz-Weber reminds us, our love of hooks has never healed us in the way that mercy has. You see, something changes with this invitation because Zacchaeus welcomes Jesus gladly, and then he announces actions that are rooted in righteousness, the very opposite of what he's been doing. And Jesus pronounces mercy and salvation. The story has been a lot for me to wrestle with this week and wonder, can we pursue righteousness and mercy with people we disagree with? But even more, can we pursue righteousness and mercy with people who have harmed us and our community? And as it's evident, I think, in Zacchaeus' story, that's where the real transformation occurs. You see, Zacchaeus' neighbors could only see him for the ways in which he was outside the lines, and rightfully so. He had done some really harmful things. They could only see him outside of that bounded set that Pastor Kyle talked about last week. That way of defining belonging by being either inside or outside of the box. A bounded set says, here's the line, you're on one side or another. But Jesus, he was able to see the ways in which Zacchaeus was trying to orient himself to God. The ways in which God's mercy and love functions more like that centered set, where we all belong even as we are in different proximity and orientation to God. The late Rachel Held Evans once said, God has a really bad habit of using people we don't approve of. What makes the gospel offensive is not who it keeps out, but who it lets in. I read once that the story of Zacchaeus is not just about figuring out how to get a glimpse of Jesus. It's about Jesus getting a glimpse of us. What does that mean? I think it means exactly what I said at the beginning of this sermon, which is that shame calls you by your sin, but Jesus calls you by your name. And we need this reminder because I think we have a habit of calling both ourselves and others by the worst thing we or they have ever done, rather than by our names. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, is a lawyer famous for taking death row cases. I've had the honor of meeting him a couple times. And perhaps his most famous quote is that we are more than the worst thing we have ever done. And this is what Jesus saw in Zacchaeus. Now, I want to be fair to the crowd. Understandably, it was very difficult for them to watch Jesus embrace Zacchaeus, this man who had been robbing their community for years, who had turned his back on his own people to turn a prophet. The crowd had every right to feel angry. And yet, I think Jesus calls them and us beyond that. Because that day, Jesus demonstrated God's extravagant love that sees our sin and chooses not to call us by that name. And I wonder, Jesus, why would you do this? I grew up in a context where I felt I was often called by my sin rather than by my name. And I struggle with walking that line between righteousness and mercy. We must be held responsible for the things we do that cause harm, and yet there's something to this mercy piece. Certainly, Jesus wasn't condoning Zacchaeus' sin or glossing over the extreme harm that had been done to the community by him, but he does embrace him. And I wonder if it was because Jesus knew that Zacchaeus wasn't going to be changed by Jesus' punishment or exclusion, but rather by his love and inclusion. Punishment and exclusion never make someone better, but love does. And this is hard. This is wildly against everything that this world tells us, everything that we tell ourselves. Now, I think it's important to mention that punishment is not the same as consequences or responsibility. Punishment says, I'm going to hurt you because you hurt me. Consequences say there is responsibility for choices we make that cause harm. Just because Jesus did not punish Zacchaeus by ignoring him or publicly shaming him, Zacchaeus did face consequences. He is held responsible for his actions, and recognizing his sin, he vows to give half of his wealth to the poor and pay back anyone that he has harmed fourfold. And this actually went beyond what the Jewish law required for reparations. And I found myself wondering if he would have been willing to make those reparations had Jesus not shown him grace. I couldn't help but see my incarcerated friends in the story of Zacchaeus. If there was ever a group of people named by their sin rather than their names, it would be the incarcerated. And I've met folks who really struggle with the work that I do. But if I've learned anything from my friends who are incarcerated, it is this: mercy heals, punishment does not. Mercy is not the opposite of righteousness. It is what helps cultivate it. I'm learning so much through my incarcerated friends how God calls me by name, not my sin, not my mistakes. And when I can hear God's voice in that way, when I can hear God call me by name instead of hearing shame's voice that calls me by all of the things that I've done wrong, well, then my failures and my mistakes, they can become places for transformation rather than a spiral of shame. And I'm realizing and learning that when I can do that for myself, perhaps I can also extend that same mercy to my neighbor. My neighbor who thinks differently. My neighbor who votes differently. My neighbor who loves differently. My neighbor, perhaps, who has caused me harm. My neighbor who has caused my community harm. My neighbor who might be sitting in a tree, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jesus in me, if only I can call them by their name instead of their sin. The Reverend Sarah R. Speed has a beautiful poem in which she says, "You could call me out. You could hang me out to dry. You could list my sins. You could shrink me down to size. Or you could call me in. You could grab my hand. You could show me what I missed." Friends, this is what God has done for us. And I wonder how God might be calling us to go and do likewise. For this is the gospel according to Zacchaeus, and it is very good news. Shame knows your name and calls you by your sin. God knows your sin and calls you by your name. God knows your neighbor's sin and calls them by name. So I wonder, who is it hardest to imagine Jesus dining with today? Go invite them to dinner and see what mercy can do. Amen.